18 hours before the county wrapped an entire neighborhood playground in bright orange hazard tape. The president of our homeowners association stood on my driveway, pointed at 3 harmless soil sensors sitting entirely on my property, and smiled like she'd already won. "Take those toys down, Mr. Grayson," she said, folding her arms against her expensive linen jacket. "You're making families nervous." I remember looking past her shoulder at the sound of children laughing from the splash pad a couple 100 feet away, and I remember thinking something that still keeps me awake once in a while. Kids don't laugh like that when they know they're standing on poisoned ground. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 43 years old, and for almost 2 decades I've worked as an environmental contamination specialist, the kind of engineer companies quietly hire after somebody realizes the ground beneath their shiny new development isn't nearly as clean as the brochures promised. My wife jokes that I trust a laboratory report more than I trust most people, and honestly, she's right. Dirt doesn't have opinions. Water doesn't lie. Numbers don't care who gets elected HOA president. That's probably why I never fit in with Copper Ridge Estates outside Scottsdale. It was one of those neighborhoods where every lawn looked identical, every mailbox matched, and every board meeting somehow turned into a contest to see who could smile while threatening their neighbors with another violation letter. My wife, Claire, always told me to ignore the politics. "We're here because we love the house," she'd say while drinking coffee on our back patio. "Not because we have to like everyone." She had a point. Most of the people were decent enough. Parents walked their dogs before sunrise. Kids rode bikes until dinner. Retired couples waved from their porches. But then there was the board, especially the president, Vanessa Holloway. Vanessa had this remarkable ability to make every conversation feel like a courtroom where she'd already decided the verdict. The first time we met, she complimented our landscaping before reminding me my trash can had been visible from the street for 42 minutes after pickup. That pretty much summed her up. So when I started noticing something strange along the edge of my property, I didn't expect her to care. It began with the groundwater monitoring well behind my workshop. I used it mostly out of habit. Environmental engineers develop weird routines, and checking groundwater clarity after heavy rain was mine. One afternoon, I lowered a sampling tube and noticed the water had a faint yellow tint. Not muddy, not algae, just wrong. Then the soil itself started behaving differently. Grass near the back fence browned despite regular irrigation. Ant colonies disappeared almost overnight. Even the mesquite tree that had survived Arizona summers for decades looked stressed. None of those things proved contamination, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I installed 3 compact monitoring stations entirely inside my property line. Nothing dramatic. A conductivity probe, a moisture sensor, and a groundwater logger no bigger than a flashlight. If everything came back normal, great. I'd lose a weekend and move on with my life. Instead, 2 days later, I found an envelope taped to my front door. Certified mail. A cease and desist notice from the HOA. According to Vanessa, my equipment created an appearance of environmental instability that could negatively impact community property values. I actually laughed out loud reading that sentence. Claire looked over my shoulder and shook her head. "They're not seriously trying to tell you what you can put on your own land." "Apparently they are," I said. The next board meeting confirmed it. Vanessa stood in front of nearly 60 homeowners with a polished smile and announced that unauthorized monitoring devices encourage fear and misinformation. Then she looked directly at me. "Some people mistake professional credentials for permission to alarm an entire community." A few neighbors glanced my way. Most looked uncomfortable. One father I barely knew caught my eye afterward and quietly asked, "Is there actually something wrong?" I answered him honestly, "I don't know yet, and that's exactly why I'm testing." He nodded, but before we could say another word, Vanessa stepped between us with that same practiced smile. "Everything has already been inspected," she said. "Please don't spread speculation." That sentence stayed with me all night because experienced engineers learn to recognize a dangerous phrase. People who are confident usually welcome more data. People hiding something hate new information. Around 10 that evening, I drove to a supply warehouse I sometimes use for fieldwork and picked up portable sampling equipment I hadn't touched in months. Claire watched me loading cases into the truck. "You're going back out there tonight, aren't you?" she asked. I smiled without answering because she already knew. She walked over, squeezed my hand, and said the one thing she always said before difficult jobs. "Trust the evidence, not the noise." Just after midnight, I climbed over the small retaining wall at the back of my property, carrying a handheld conductivity meter, a soil logger, and enough testing equipment to answer one simple question that refused to leave my mind. If Vanessa was so desperate to stop 3 harmless sensors, what exactly was she afraid they were about to find? Around 12:30, the neighborhood was completely silent except for the hum of air conditioners and the occasional coyote, somewhere beyond the wash. That's one thing I always loved about Arizona nights. They make the desert feel peaceful enough that you almost forget how much is happening underneath the surface. I switched on my handheld meter, pressed the probe into the first soil sample, and immediately frowned. The electrical conductivity was nearly 4 times higher than it should have been. I recalibrated the instrument because I assumed I had made a mistake. Same result. I moved 10 feet farther, even higher, 20 feet farther, almost directly behind the playground fence. The numbers climbed again. No, I whispered to myself. That can't be right. I pulled out the soil auger and bored down nearly 3 feet before collecting another sample. As soon as I lifted it into the flashlight beam, I caught a faint chemical odor. Not gasoline exactly, not fertilizer either. Something sharper that reminded me of industrial runoff I'd encountered years earlier during a remediation project outside Tucson. By 2 in the morning, I had collected samples from 12 different locations, carefully labeled every container, photographed GPS coordinates, and documented everything on video because experience had taught me that evidence disappears whenever powerful people realize it's inconvenient. Back home, my detached garage doubled as a compact field laboratory. Claire was still awake, wrapped in a blanket, pretending to read while she waited for me. She looked at my face before I even spoke. It's bad, isn't it? I didn't answer immediately. I slid the first sample beneath the portable analyzer and watched the display scroll through its calibration cycle. Nitrate concentration, elevated. Phosphorus, elevated. Then heavy metals began appearing one after another. Lead, chromium, copper, zinc. Levels fluctuated depending on the sample, but several exceeded what any child should ever be exposed to. One location measured nearly 600% above recommended limit. Claire covered her mouth without saying a word. We both stared at the screen as if somehow it would change its mind. It didn't. Maybe it's isolated, she finally whispered. Maybe it's just one spot. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But contamination doesn't usually arrange itself into neat little circles. It follows water. It follows gravity. It follows whatever path people create when they decide cutting corners is cheaper than following environmental law. By sunrise, I wasn't trying to prove contamination anymore. I was trying to figure out where it was coming from. The next morning, I requested every publicly available drainage plan, grading permit, environmental review, and construction document associated with Copper Ridge Estates. Years of consulting had taught me exactly where to look and exactly which offices kept forgotten records. Nobody else bothered reading. A retired clerk at the county engineering department recognized my name from an old remediation project and quietly pointed me toward archived utility maps that hadn't yet been digitized. Most people never ask for these, he said with a shrug. They're boring. I smiled. Boring documents solve expensive problems, he laughed. That's why I like engineers. It took most of the afternoon to piece everything together. Then, suddenly, every puzzle piece locked into place. 6 years earlier, right before the HOA proudly unveiled its new playground and splash pad, contractors had rerouted a stormwater collection line that originally emptied into a municipal treatment channel. Instead, someone approved a revised drainage route feeding into a buried infiltration system directly beneath the recreation area. On paper, it looked harmless because the documents described it as excess rainwater management. But another permit told a different story. The clubhouse parking lot drained into the exact same underground network. So did maintenance storage, landscaping runoff, fertilizer wash, herbicides, pesticides. Everything collected together before disappearing beneath the place where children now played every afternoon. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. You have got to be kidding me. Claire read over my shoulder. Is this legal? Not even close. Could they really have done this? Only if nobody asked questions. Suddenly, Vanessa's behavior made perfect sense. The cease and desist letter wasn't about property values. The board meeting wasn't about neighborhood appearance. They weren't afraid of my sensors. They were afraid of what those sensors would inevitably document. That realization changed everything. I wasn't dealing with an overbearing HOA anymore. I was dealing with people who had spent years hoping nobody with technical knowledge ever looked beneath the grass. The following afternoon, I visited the playground during one of its busiest hours. Parents filled picnic tables while children ran between swings. slides, and a splash pad. A little girl chased bubbles across artificial turf that sat only a few feet above one of the contaminated zones I'd sampled. Her father laughed while recording her on his phone. I stood there longer than I should have, feeling completely torn. If I walked over and warned everyone immediately without airtight evidence, the HOA would accuse me of creating panic. If I waited until I had irrefutable proof, children would keep playing there. That may have been the hardest ethical decision of my entire career. I settled on the only option I could defend: gather enough evidence that no lawyer, politician, or HOA board could bury it. The next morning, a landscaping crew arrived near the playground. Instead of trimming bushes, they began replacing sections of decorative gravel exactly where my highest readings had been recorded. My stomach dropped. Coincidence? Maybe. But years in environmental investigations had taught me one uncomfortable truth: people rarely start moving dirt unless they know what's buried underneath it. I drove straight home, unpacked every advanced instrument I still owned, and called two former colleagues whose integrity I trusted with my life. One was a hydrogeologist named Melissa Grant. The other was a geophysical survey specialist, Owen Delgado, who had spent years mapping underground contamination plumes with ground-penetrating radar. Neither one asked many questions. Melissa simply said, "If you're calling me instead of sending an email, this is serious." "It is," Owen laughed softly. "Tell me you finally found something bigger than leaking fuel tanks." "I think I found something underneath a neighborhood playground." There was silence for nearly 5 seconds before he answered. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." We met before sunrise outside my property with enough equipment to look like a small research expedition. Melissa calibrated groundwater probes while Owen assembled the radar unit, and I installed additional monitoring stations along my property line, making sure every camera angle documented exactly where each sensor sat so nobody could later claim we crossed onto HOA property. Claire handled livestream logistics from the garage, quietly reminding me that transparency would become our strongest protection if things turned ugly. Around 8:30, just as Owen began the first radar pass, a black luxury SUV rolled to a stop beside us. Vanessa climbed out wearing oversized sunglasses and that same perfectly rehearsed smile. "Mr. Mercer," she called loudly enough for several neighbors to hear. "I thought we already settled this misunderstanding." I looked up from my equipment. "Actually, we're just getting started." She glanced at the radar cart, the cameras, and a growing crowd of curious residents watching from across the street. For the first time since I'd met her, the confidence in her expression flickered ever so slightly, and something told me the next few hours were about to change that neighborhood forever. Owen didn't answer Vanessa right away. He simply pushed the radar unit forward another few feet, watched the screen populate with subsurface reflections, then slowly turned it so everyone standing nearby could see. Even without technical training, the image was impossible to ignore. 3 enormous dark plumes stretched beneath the playground like spilled ink beneath a sheet of glass. Melissa compared the radar map with the groundwater samples we'd taken only hours earlier and quietly nodded at me. "They're connected." My stomach tightened. I had expected contamination. I hadn't expected it to be this widespread. Vanessa forced out a laugh that sounded far less confident than the one she'd arrived with. "Those graphics don't prove anything," she said. "You're creating a spectacle." Before I could answer, one of the fathers who had spoken with me after the HOA meeting stepped closer. "Then let him finish," he said calmly. "If he's wrong, you've got nothing to worry about." More neighbors gathered. Phones came out. Claire kept the live stream running while I explained every step exactly as we performed it, showing calibration records, timestamps, GPS coordinates, chain of custody labels, everything an investigator would expect to see. There would be no accusations that we'd manipulated evidence because the entire process was unfolding in real time. Within an hour, our live stream had spread far beyond Copper Ridge. Reporters began calling. Then the County Environmental Response Office called. I sent them every file before they even arrived. By early afternoon, White County trucks rolled into the neighborhood. Inspectors collected independent samples, while children were escorted away from the playground. Parents who had smiled only hours earlier now stood behind temporary barricades asking question after question. One mother approached me holding her son's inhaler with trembling hands. "He's been getting headaches every weekend after we came here," she said quietly. "Our doctor thought it was allergies." I didn't know what to tell her because I couldn't promise the contamination had caused his symptoms. All I could honestly say was, "You deserve real answers." 24 hours later, those answers started arriving. The county laboratory confirmed elevated concentrations of nitrates, heavy metals, ammonia, and petroleum-related compounds beneath multiple sections of the playground. 2 days later, investigators traced the contamination back to an illegally modified drainage network that had been collecting runoff from the clubhouse parking lot, maintenance storage, and heavily treated landscaping areas for years. Someone had approved shortcuts that should never have passed inspection, and somewhere along the way, people simply stopped asking questions. The emergency HOA meeting that followed wasn't really a meeting at all. It was a public reckoning. Residents filled every seat, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallway. Vanessa tried to blame contractors, then previous board members, then outdated engineering reports. Every explanation collapsed as county officials projected drainage maps and laboratory findings onto the screen. Finally, she turned toward me. "Why didn't you come directly to us?" The room became completely silent. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I did. You sent me a cease and desist letter." Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. The silence itself was louder than anything else in that room. 72 hours after we started scanning, the county issued a formal notice of violation, imposed a $120,000 penalty, ordered full soil excavation and remediation within 90 days, shut the playground indefinitely, and opened a criminal investigation into possible negligent endangerment involving minors. By then, Vanessa came to my front porch without cameras, without attorneys, without the confidence she'd carried for years. "Please," she said softly, "don't release anything else until we have time to fix this." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered every parent standing behind those barricades wondering whether their children had been exposed to something preventable. "You weren't asking for time when you demanded I remove my sensors," I replied. "You weren't asking for cooperation when you tried to silence me. You had years to fix this." I handed her a written proposal instead. Reimburse every dollar I'd spent investigating the contamination. Compensate me for the wrongful enforcement actions the HOA had taken. Remove the current board. Hire an independent environmental consultant chosen by the residents, not the directors. And issue a public apology acknowledging that monitoring scientific evidence should never have been treated as a violation. The residents approved every condition themselves. Excavators eventually tore apart the entire playground, hauling away thousands of tons of contaminated soil before rebuilding it from scratch. Insurance claims followed. Lawsuits followed. 2 former board members were later charged in connection with environmental compliance failures, and the HOA spent well over $200,000 before the crisis finally settled. As for me, I accepted the community's request to serve as its independent environmental advisor, not because I wanted another title, but because I never wanted another engineer to be told that gathering facts was somehow more dangerous than ignoring them. Sometimes I drive past the rebuilt playground and watch children laughing again, and I think about how close everyone came to never knowing what was buried beneath their feet. Vanessa once believed 3 little soil sensors threatened her neighborhood. The truth was, those sensors saved it. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have stopped after the cease and desist letter? Or would you have kept digging until the truth came out no matter who it embarrassed? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I genuinely like to hear where you stand.